Lord Meghnad Desai, Shri Vivek Debroy, Shri Pathak, Shri Ratin Roy, Shri Bhandari, many distinguished personages in the audience and delegates. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be given this recognition by the Skoch Foundation, which has been conducting not only these seminars and conferences that we have been participating in, but recognizing and awarding honors in different fields, as we have just seen. I have been asked to speak on a job-generative economic agenda. Let me take a few minutes to cover a few of the following grounds. I believe that jobs are the single biggest challenge that we face today, and not just in India. I believe it is a problem that is global. There are dire warnings coming out from multilateral organizations like the World Bank, from pundits and commentators around the world, that due to automation, machine learning, technology, jobs as we have known it are going to be available in much less numbers, much fewer numbers throughout the world. The World Bank, in fact, has said that something like 68% of jobs, existing jobs in India, are at risk of being obsolete because of technology. The challenge in other countries is also similar, some a little less and some a little more than that shocking 68% number. But I would like to take a few minutes to talk about how we have reached where we have reached. If you turn the clock back, as Vivek Debroy did a couple of centuries, it is an oft-repeated statistic that India represented something like a quarter of world GDP as late as the 18th century. But we don't need to go that far. Even as a developing poor nation in the 20th century, in modern times, there are some stark statistics. I would like to compare ourselves with China, which is the only other country that has more than 1 billion population. Now, in the 7 decades since we achieved independence, we have established not only the world's largest democracy, the largest democracy in the history of the world, but one that is respected, one that is held up to as an icon around the world. This cannot be said of many other countries. But where we have done less well is that many of our peers 70 years ago have done economically much better and have faced the challenge of poverty much better than we have. Now, for many decades, we used to brush away those comparisons by saying that the Southeast Asian tiger economies were small countries and that it was not comparable to compare with a large country like India. But that changed with what has happened with China in the last 3.5 decades. So if you turn the clock back to the late 1970s, it's a very interesting situation. China and India, the only two countries which today have more than 1 billion population, in the late 70s had a per capita income more or less in the same range. Now, since then, the Chinese economy grew dramatically faster, not faster just than the Indian economy, but more or less any other economy in the world. And it reached a level where the Chinese economy went up to 5.5 times of India's economy, from being more or less on par at a per capita basis. Now, this was because in a country where they did not have democracy, where they do not have to carry millions of people in changing policies, if only the top 5 or 6 people get convinced of a change, they can implement it. What China did, starting with Deng Xiaoping and several of his successor leaders, is turn around their economic policies to a much more market-friendly, competitive environment, pushed the gas pedal to the floor and kept it there for 3 decades. So that with double-digit growth over 3.5 decades, you've reached this scenario where They went to 5.5 times of our economy and did a much better job of reducing poverty and a much better job of creating jobs. Now, that is a window that we missed. There is no point talking about what could have happened in the 80s and 90s and 10 or 15 years ago. Now, interestingly, in the last 25 years, since we started our economic reforms, we haven't exactly been a slouch either. India has gradually shifted up its growth rate from the derisively called Hindu rate of growth in the 50s and 60s to now being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and in many quarters being the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now, the reason this is important is we have for too long got stuck in a debate in our country justifying growth. I have seen in my 17.5 years in Parliament, finance minister after finance minister after finance minister having to justify why growth is important. This is the real tragedy that we had to face, because there are legitimate arguments that growth alone is not sufficient, that there has to be inclusive growth, and that large sections of our population have to be carried upwards by the growth. But to question growth itself, the point I'm trying to make is, it is legitimate to argue that growth is necessary but not sufficient. But to question growth is what has cost us a lot of lost time. Now, fortunately, that is changing. And despite hiccups, when we have seen our growth go up and go down, we are approaching a level today where growth seems to be, at least in the last quarter, we have seen it bounce back from the disruptions caused by policies which I believe will have long-term positive effects, although they had short-term disruptions. Let me give you some good news and some bad news. The good news is, while the Chinese economy went up to 5.5 times of the Indian economy, some publications globally, such as The Economist, predicted that it would go up even further and that it would become 6 times of the Indian economy. That didn't happen. What has actually happened is Chinese growth, after many decades of double-digit growth, seems to be stabilizing over the past 3 or 4 years. And Indian growth has been picking up, although not consistently, but in fits and starts. And as a result, the ratio has somewhat improved in India's favor, slightly. So from 5.5 times, today's ratio is only about 5 times of, so Chinese economy is about 5 times of Indian economy. And we need to, of course, catch up a lot. It will take time. The differential growth rates will only kick in over the next decade or 2 decades before we can even dream about going back to the per capita parity that we used to enjoy back in the late 1970s. Now, as I've said before, growth is important. It should not be questioned, but it can't be enough, because we do need to uplift millions of people. And as has been pointed out by many pundits, economists of the highest order, such as Lord Desai here, we have others like Vivek, we have Jagdish Bhagwati in Colombia, that indeed growth has helped millions, in fact hundreds of millions, to be brought out of dire poverty. But we need to do a lot more. Now, Vivek in his talk mentioned the 4 areas of land, capital, entrepreneurship, and labor laws. I don't want to go over all of them again, but I do wish to emphasize labor laws. I have come from a corporate background where I can tell you, not just I, but all my colleagues bent over backwards to not create jobs. Because the hassle of dealing with the labor laws is such a disincentive that we would do economically less rational things, like invest in equipment where manual labor actually would have been cheaper and more cost effective. We bent over backwards, and even today when I talk to people around the country, you will see, they may not say it specifically, many economists may not focus on the issue so much anymore, but our labor laws are not just a problem because they only cater to 8% of labor. I mean, if we then take that forward and say the other 92% who are not in the formal sector should be covered by similar labor laws, we will do a terrible damage and terrible disservice. We do need labor laws. We do need to protect our people. But as Bhagwati and Panagaria have written, of the about 200 labor laws in the country, it is impossible to abide by all. You can be sure that if you are abiding by some, you are in fact violating some others. We need to have labor laws to protect people, but there must be a fine balance where we do not disincentivize the creation of jobs. And until we do that, we are not going to be creating enough jobs. But the bad news I have for you is that everything that we do, we are trying to make up. Labor laws have not yet been reformed at the national level, but at the state level, efforts are being made in several states. Growth is beginning to catch up. The ease of doing business index shows that India is rapidly improving as a place that attracts investment, which will undoubtedly create jobs. But after a lot of effort, we have just cracked the top 100. The Prime Minister, 3 years ago when he got sworn in, announced a goal that India ought not to be in the 140-odd rank, should be in the top 50. It has taken us 3 years to come into the top 100. The goal of getting into the top 50 will require more heavy lifting. To do away with a lot of red tape, to do away with a lot of hurdles in the way of investment and job creation. Some work is being done. Recently, the government announced that something like 1,200 obsolete laws, many of them going back to the 19th century, have been repealed. Laws which perpetuate the license permit inspector Raj, who come and inspect whether your factories have lime painting on the walls or not. These will help, but we need to do more. If we are not in the top 50, and if we don't set our sights on being in the top 20 and the top 10 in the ease of doing business index, we are not going to be able to create the number of jobs that we require. But the really bad news is, no matter what we do, the same level of high growth rates will no longer create the same number of jobs. Today, we are back up to above 6% growth rate, and I am firmly convinced that because of the structural changes made by introducing GST and many other steps, we are going to reach 7%, maybe 8%, and it's possible we'll go beyond that as well. But 7% or 8% or even 10% growth rate no longer creates the same number of jobs that it would have created in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because of what I mentioned, because of automation, because of robotics, because of machine learning. China maintained more than 10% growth rate for more than 3 decades and created hundreds of millions of jobs. Now, even if we go to 10% and keep it up for 3 decades, it's a good thing, we should do it. We must have high growth rates. It will lead to many other benefits. It will lead to revenues going up. It will lead to resources being available for infrastructure and many other benefits. But we must reconcile to the fact that today's economic profile in the 21st century will create less number of jobs, apple to apple, for the same growth rates that in the past used to create many more jobs. Now, how do we overcome this? Does that mean we give up on this? Of course not. Of course we must build more infrastructure. Of course we must ease our red tape. Of course we must go up higher on the ease of doing business index. And on all of these fronts, efforts are being made, and you can see that day in and day out. If you sift through a lot of narrative and commentary which has very strong biases, if you look at it more neutrally, you will find that lots is happening. For example, an objective measure is that we have gone up a dramatic number of places on the ease of doing business index, and you can see other such objective measures such as Moody's upward rating of our sovereign debt profile. But if we are to face up to the jobs challenge, while we should do all of these things, while we should encourage entrepreneurship, while we should ease access to credit and capital, while we should invest in skills training, which are crucial, we will still have a shortfall. And one of the ideas that is making the rounds over the last few years is a universal basic income, a UBI. Now, ironically, the UBI, which sounds like a socialistic idea, actually comes from many capitalists. It comes from Silicon Valley, people who are creating this joblessness because of automation, because of artificial intelligence, because of machine learning. Now, I have been inspired by talks with several economists around the world to advocate for a universal basic income. I first wrote about it, and I believe I was the first one in Parliament, at least, to highlight it 2 years ago, and then I have been writing repeatedly and advocating it. Now, I just want to say a few things and wrap up, because this is not the forum to talk at length about UBI. But if you're interested, please Google. I have written articles and given interviews which go into it more in detail, and there are many eminent economists who have written at great length on it. If we are to keep people out of poverty, a bare minimum payment would do that. And the estimate in India is to keep them above the so-called Tendulkar poverty line is 1,000 rupees a person per month. Now, while UBI is being debated internationally as something that's difficult to achieve because you have to cut other social service expenditures, in India, I believe it's a much easier deal, simply because the social expenditure that we have is so inefficient. I want to remind you something that a prime minister said 30 years ago. The then prime minister in 1985 said that out of every rupee that the government spends, only 15 paisa reaches the citizen. 85 paisa goes away in salaries, wages, overheads, and corruption and leakage. Do you know what that number is today? It has actually improved, but not by that much. I keep a track of this, and depending on the government scheme that you analyze, whether it is public distribution system, PDS, or others, somewhere between 40 to 73% never reaches the citizen. Out of every rupee that we spend from taxpayers' money from the government, somewhere between 40 to 73 paisa does not reach the citizen, depending on the scheme, depending on the region. That is a terrible, terrible inefficiency. But I think it's also an opportunity. Western countries don't have that level of inefficiency. And so if they had to cut something, it would pinch in order to provide a universal basic income. We have the ability, and we are seeing that with technology, with biometrics, with Aadhaar-linked transition to subsidies from physical handouts by government to a regime of direct cash into the hands of citizens. And you're seeing dramatic improvements with just the few schemes that have been started, such as the LPG cooking gas cylinders being transitioned to cash transfer. Nandan Nilekani announced just a few weeks ago that $9 billion have already been saved in saving the inefficiencies. I believe that using a similar methodology of biometrics-linked direct cash transfers, we can both save on governmental expenditures. In other words, we will improve the fiscal deficit, which improves the country's credit ratings. And at the same time, we will be able to afford something like a universal basic income. A couple of other questions. Why should it be universal? Why should people like us get it? Answer is very simple. I have seen how these government schemes are handed out. There are armies of people, officers out in the fields evaluating who is a likely candidate. They look for whether you have electricity, whether you live in a thatched hut or a concrete home, whether you have a bicycle or a motorcycle. Tremendous wasted effort and a lot of inefficiency and corruption. People have to pay bribes to get listed that they do actually have a thatched home. If you make it universal and you say that you have to go to the local kirana shop, give your biometrics and collect 1,000 rupees, people like us won't do it. Those who really need it will go and collect that 1,000 rupees and be above destitution. That's why universal and not targeted, because targeting is a huge wasted effort. So I will conclude by saying that we will need something like a universal basic income, because all the efforts that we are making, laudable, will have results, will pay off in the long run, will not be enough in the short and medium term to keep hundreds of millions of us above the poverty level. And a universal basic income is better affordable in India than most other countries, simply because of the inefficiencies we have already had. And the final argument is, will it make people disinclined to work? Well, if you pay them 50,000 rupees a month, yes, it might. Pay them 1,000 rupees a month to just keep them out of destitution? No. I spend nearly 2 weeks every month in, month out, with people in my constituency and in other constituencies. No. 1,000 rupees will indeed be dramatically useful to keep them out of poverty, but it will not take away their incentive to work. This, apart from all the other things of creating infrastructure, making it easier to invest and create jobs, this is what we must do to have a job-generative economic agenda. Thank you. Jai Hind.